Okay, this is Unit 8 video part 2 in our review series, and we're talking about the banking system. And this is probably the most challenging part of the whole unit. So let's jump in. First, the banking system, we have to understand what the Federal Reserve is because the Fed plays a very vital role in the banking system. The Federal Reserve is the bank of banks. It's the overarching bank. It does a lot of things, right? But the main things that we're worried about and that we pay attention to are it sets the reserve ratio. The reserve ratio is a percentage of checkable deposits that have to be set aside, that cannot be touched. The reason we do this is in a fractional banking system, we have to make sure that if people do run on the banks, we at least have a certain portion of their checkable deposits on hand to pay them back. And so we can't lend out 100% of the money we have because then people won't trust the banks anymore. And they'll keep their money out of it because they'll be worried that if they put their money in the bank, it's going to be lent out. And then when they go to withdraw that money, it's not going to be there anymore. So that's the reserve ratio, very important, set by the Federal Reserve. Second thing they do is they regulate all of the banks. They are the great regulator, right? So any standards that are being set, including the reserve ratio, are set by the Federal Reserve. Um, Remember that they're independent, that they issue currency, they're the ones that hold all the reserves. They give short-term loans to banks at the discount rate. They collect checks and make sure that banks that are clearing checks against the other, all that's tracked on the reserve level. They run the finances for the government, so they're their fiscal agent, collecting taxes. All that tax revenue is stored there. All of the purchases of weaponry and things like that are going through them. But the most important function, that's a lot of functions, is that they change the supply of money. They help in times of recession, and they help in times of an inflationary gap through implementing what we call contractionary and expansionary monetary policy. And they do that through changing the supply of money, which has a chain effect on several other things. Changes the interest rate, which changes investment, which changes uh, aggregate demand, which changes GDP and price level across the board. Okay, so that's the most important stuff. Know those things. There's a couple questions on the Federal Reserve. I just have an idea of what they are and who they are. Let's get to the big one. You need to know how to analyze this banking balance sheet. And it's a bit of a doozy. It's new. We don't do anything like this at any other time. It's not like a normal graph, and so it can be a stumbling block for students, definitely. And if you struggle with this, there are several examples on the Rev Review where you can try it out. We did one of them in class today just to try and make sure that everybody's on the same page on how to approach one of these. So as we go through these, I'm just going to change them over here, and we'll calculate things as we go. So first, you have to understand the banking balance sheet. Understand that assets and the liabilities and net worth are equal, right? So the left side and the right side have to balance every single time. So our checkable deposits over here are considered a liability because they're owed. Remember, liabilities are always owed. Somebody has a claim on them. So they deposited their money there, but I still owe them that money back. So you can think of checkable deposits as kind of an IOU, right? You gave me money, I'm holding on to it, put it in my reserves, but I know I have to keep a note over here that I owe you that money back. And then stock shares, same as owner's equity, same deal, right there, $45,000. And that's when somebody invests and owns your company. They can pull their investment at any time and have to pay that back to them. Okay. On the asset side, we have reserves. Reserves is basically the cash holdings of a bank, right? Whenever they have extra money, they put it into reserves. It's held at the Federal Reserve. They don't hold cash in banks anymore. And then they can access those reserves to do different things. Okay. Loans, especially when you see them here, loans are when they give out money. They've already given it out in this instant. So it doesn't impact you a whole lot, but it's one of the things they can do with excess reserves. And loans, remember, are the things that can create new money. A loan given to somebody becomes a checkable deposit for somebody else, and that's that poof money, right? It comes out of nowhere. And then finally, securities. Securities, another term for bonds, same deal, right? A bond or security is an IOU from the government. So we get the IOU, and the bank gave money to the government, $110,000, so the government could pay their bills. All right, so that's a brief overview of that. Things you need to know. You need to be able to find the reserve ratio. Oh, don't know how to do that. You have to be able to find the reserve ratio, right? So if you're given the information over here, you should be able to find it. Or if they tell you the reserve ratio, you should be able to find it. On this instance, I ask you what the reserve ratio is, you actually can't figure it out. You need a little more information, right? They gave me total reserves, not excess and required. If I have required reserves here, I could easily divide required by my checkable deposits. That would kick out my reserve ratio for me. But here I need more information, right? So let's say that our reserve ratio, for our sake here, I'm gonna get a calculator here. Nope, not a calculator. There we go. Calculator here. Let's say our reserve ratio is, I don't know, 20%, right? So I take my 130,000 and I multiply that by 0.2, and that's the amount of money that I have to set aside. My required reserves are going to be $26,000, right? $26,000 of my 130,000 cannot be touched because the Federal Reserve said it. And if people come to withdraw their money from me, that money has to be there, it has to be accessible to them. So $26,000 is going to be my required reserves as a result. So what are my excess reserves? Well, it's not the rest of that 130,000. Remember, I already did some stuff with the rest of that money. So it's actually going to be the difference between my required reserves and my total reserves. My required are 26,000, my total are 40,000, then $14,000 are going to be my excess reserves. Why is that important? Well, excess reserves are also known as loanable funds. This is the money I can actually lend out to consumers and lend out to banks so that they can invest in their businesses. So it's really, really important. That's actually the money creating potential are your excess reserves. $14,000 are my excess reserves there. Next, you have to understand the chain loan impact. You don't have to actually graph anything or chart it out, but understand that this is our multiplied effect. When a loan is given out, that loan is used to purchase something else. So if I give you a loan for a car, then you're going to go and buy that car. Now, it's debt to you, but to the car company, that's real money. And they take that money and they put it in the bank as a checkable deposit, and poof, new money was created. Your loan is somebody else's money. Then the bank's going to put a portion of that over for required reserves. The rest of it's going to be excess, loanable funds. They're going to give those loans out because that's how they make money. And somebody else is going to buy a house. Give them a loan for their house. That money, it's debt to you, but to the house company or the realtor that's selling you that house, it's real money. They take that money, they put it in the bank. It's another checkable deposit. Poof, more money's created. On and on and on it goes until we get to zero, right? There's a really actually simple way to track that chain loan impact, which is just by calculating the multiplier. You don't have to go through all those stages. So the multiplier is 1 over the reserve ratio. 1 over the reserve ratio. So let me pop this up here. I'm going to make a note that my excess reserves are 14,000. Here we go. I'm going to make another note that my money multiplier, or my required reserve ratio, sorry. My reserve ratio is 20%. Now, how do I find my money multiplier? It's 1 over my reserve ratio in hundreds. My reserve ratio is 20%, so it's going to be 1 over 0.2. And you guys know, because you memorized it a few years ago, or units ago. Might feel like a few years ago in this class. And it's going to kick out the number 5. So our multiplier is 5. Now I can find my total change in the supply of money that this bank can do, right? This bank can give out $14,000 of excess reserves. That's their initial change in the money supply. But that 14,000 can have a multiplied impact in the banking system as a whole. So 14,000 times 5, my excess reserves, times my money multiplier, but will be the total change in the supply of money that can happen as a result. So I take my 14 grand, multiply it by 5, and so $70,000, 70K, is my change in the supply of money, right? That's the impact right there that can happen from just the excess reserves from this particular bank. There's some variations on that might say, hey, there's a new deposit or a new withdrawal on here. What's the change and how's that going to change the supply of money? That absolutely happens all the time. Keep that in mind. We did an example of that in class, or examples on the rare review of that as well. Let's move on. Another way that the supply of money could change is through the buying and selling of bonds. This is actually what the Fed does all the time, right? The Fed will buy bonds or securities from a bank. When they do that, they reduce the securities and they increase the reserves by that exact amount. And all of those increases are going to be excess reserves. It's not like checkable deposits. Remember, if I change checkable deposits, I have to change my required reserves. And so a portion of that's going to come out of required reserves. But that's not the case with bonds. There's no regulation on it. Nobody's owed that except the government, so I don't have to hold off a side of that money. Right? So let's say the government buys $20,000 of bonds from this bank, right? So I change this and I take 20,000 off. So now I have 90,000 in securities because I sold those securities or those bonds to the Fed. Fed has them now. What happened with that 20 grand? Well, that goes right up here into my reserves. So I'm going to have 60,000 in reserves. None of that is going to be required. So if I have 14K before in excess reserves, I just added $20,000 to that. So it's going to be 34K as a result. And as you can see, I dramatically increase the amount of loanable funds that can then have a multiplied impact on my economy. So keep that in mind whenever you're changing securities. Securities will go down. Reserves, excess reserves specifically, will go up by that exact total amount. And when the Fed buys bonds, it has an immediate impact on the supply of money. As soon as those bonds go down and the excess reserves go up, there's new money in the economy that wasn't there before. That's not the case with checkable deposits. Somebody takes their cash and deposits it in the bank. It's just going from a checkable deposit to or from cash to a checkable deposit. It's still M1 in both instances, so there's no change. But with bonds, when the Fed buys bonds, they take those bonds out of the market. That was M2. They inject new money into the market and reserves or cash. That's M1. M1 is increasing while M2 falls. And so it increases the supply of actual money, or M1 in that instant. Okay? Remember, whenever there's a change in checkable deposits, you have to recalculate reserves. Right? So let's say our checkable deposits, there's a new deposit, I'll do ND, of 10,000. 10K. What do? First, I increase my checkable deposit. So this is going to be 140,000 instead of 130. After I do that, I then calculate how much of this has to be set aside and how much of it required reserves and how much of it is excess. So I know 20% of this is going to be required reserves. So 20% of 10,000, pop it in here, 10, 1, 2, 3 times 0.2 is going to be 2 grand. So my required reserves are going to be 2 grand. So I know I'm going to increase required reserves by that amount. My excess reserves then are going to change by the rest of that, or 8 grand. And then I just add those to my required and excess reserves I calculated before, but erase now to get the new excess and required reserves. That will work every single time for you, but keep that in mind, right? And also remember, when there's a change in deposits, there's no initial change in supply of money. It only changes when that first set of loans go out with excess reserves. Okay. Hopefully that was helpful to you. And that's it for part 2. So next up, we'll talk about the money market, but banking system, a very important one. Make sure you know those different elements. I would emphasize knowing the reserve ratio, knowing how to calculate required and excess reserves, practice with bonds, changes with bonds, practice with changes with checkable deposits, and then make sure you know excess reserves times the money multiplier will give you a change in supply of money.